Hey, this is Juan, and this is Faith in Film's Deep Dive. Now, what Deep Dive is a critical analysis of a film that me or one of my other co-hosts of Faith in Film has seen. Now, be warned, this is a very spoiler-heavy review of films, as it is almost a scene-by-scene analysis. So, the movie I will be reviewing today is Fences. If you haven't seen it, just pause on this video and come back later. Or if you're listening on SoundCloud, just come back later. Now, although I will attempt to do a scene-by-scene analysis of this film, I'm doing most of this by memory. So if I miss a few parts, just tell me in the comment section. So here we go. Fences. This Denzel Washington directed adaptation of an August Wilson play tells the story of Troy Maxson in 1950s Pittsburgh. The movie was a critical and box office success and my own personal favorite of 2016, so let me get down to the review. For me, Fences tells the story of what it cost a black man to love and also the cost of loving a black man. Our main protagonist, Troy, is a very complex and flawed individual. As charming and charismatic as he can be during the film, he can be just as repulsive and delusional. He is a man who seems to have some sort of principle in life, and that is mainly a reaction to his trauma and what life, or in Troy's eyes, death hasn't stolen from him yet. His biggest mantra seems to be around responsibilities to those you owe, mainly family. Something he learned from his father, who was a terrible person but ultimately took care of his kids out of a sense of duty. Now, Troy's father didn't have the best relationship with his mother, and Troy initially seems to be a better man than his father because of his love and treatment of Rose, but even that falls apart with his adultery. See, the movie opens with Troy and Bono working in the back of a garbage truck and discussing Troy's pending case with the union board. Troy complains that none of the black workers are drivers, this movie's first declaration of Troy's discontent in life. Only here we see it as something admirable. Admirable is the right word for that. It's early. Bear with me. It also sets up the subplot of Troy having to be seen before the board to decide if he can keep his job or not. Anyway, Bono and Troy began walking home from work, and Bono delivers the first of his many reviews. Bono, for me, in this movie brings in a conversation around one of the costs of loving a black man, as another black man is the need for accountability. And that's a point I will get into a little more later on. He sees Troy has been eyeing this woman down at the bar, Alberta, and even catches him walking near her house. Now, this conversation is really the only description that we get of Alberta, and let me tell you, it is brilliant. The movie never shows you the other woman for Troy, and I think that's because her physical appearance doesn't matter. The fact that she exists does. Now look, Viola Davis is a beautiful woman. But let's just say Alberta steps on the screen and she is, insert whatever actress you think is more attractive than Viola Davis. Does that change your reaction to Troy's behavior? Anyway, she's described as a woman from down south, and Troy and Bono talk of southern women as thicker. You could probably also assume from the appearance of Raynell that she might have been a lighter toned black woman, which then opens up another conversation as well. That's besides the point. At this juncture in the movie, we are just seeing the seeds of what Troy's greatest failure will be. Troy head to the backyard and Rose exits the house. The three of them begin talking back and forth with the addition of Troy's eldest son, Lyons, a little later in the scene. For me, this scene sets up a lot of really important things in the film. Let me start by talking about Rose in the scene. Rose comes across as a loving wife in person. Her initial conversation revolves around making sure Troy is fed after work, in addition to Bono and Lyons as well. Rose isn't just a submissive housewife that plays the background either. She is constantly calling Troy out for how delusional he is. Bono notes this and says, Rose is a woman that will set Troy straight every time. And for me, that's one of the more powerful qualities to Rose in this script. Her loving, caring demeanor and willingness to serve isn't at all in conflict with her ability to be a bigger personality and take up space, even though compared to Troy, there often isn't that much space available. Now, Troy steals the rest of the scene for me as he tells two very important stories, and his altercation with his son paints a picture of who he really is. Troy tells the story of how he fought death, and not metaphorically either, a physical embodiment of death. Rose tells us that it was just pneumonia, but Troy is convinced in his truth. He battles death and comes to a stalemate, so he takes Death's sickle and tosses it somewhere Death has to go find it. Troy then escapes and remarks that as long as he can stay vigilant, that Death cannot catch him, and on the day that they cross paths again, he'd be ready. He gives this speech about vigilance as he is drinking, and Rose is telling him to slow down. He notes that drinking isn't a problem for him. It isn't his vice. The story would prove that to be true. Drinking isn't his vice. Contentment is. Later on in the film, we see when his discontentment leads him to an affair and his marriage falls apart. He becomes a drunk, but that's more of a reaction to loss than a desire for drunkenness. In other words, Troy doesn't become a drunk because he likes to drink. He does it because he has lost everything that makes him content, and being drunk provides him some form of anesthesia. Lyons shows up around this time, and Troy is immediately suspicious of Lyons, as he says he only sees his eldest son when he wants to borrow money. Now, Troy doesn't have a really good relationship with either of his sons, but the brokenness is definitely different between the two. He is hard on both Lyons and Corey, but there seems to be more of a willingness to compromise with Lyons than Corey. From their interactions, it seems Troy might be harder on Corey if at 32 Corey came to ask him for money. I read that Troy has some guilt that he wasn't able to raise Lyons because he was in jail. In their argument, Troy says Lyons was just raised wrong, and Lyons retorts, "You wouldn't know anything about that because you weren't there." One of the few moments of real anger from Lyons in the whole film. In this scene, Troy's biggest issue with his son is that he isn't working a steady job. One of Troy's biggest admonishments to his sons is to get jobs that are steady and no one can take them from them. How ironic. Troy's jobs may be taken from him because he spoke up. Lyons is an artist at heart and can't imagine himself just punching the clock. For Troy, survival and contentment rely on stability. For Lyons, it is in fulfillment of joy and pleasure. Funny enough, I think the movie shows the downfall of when they both see survival from Lyons' standpoint. Troy ends up cheating and Lyons ends up in prison. The movie doesn't teach that Troy's perspective is right either, but the real answer may come in balance. One which Corey initially has with his desire to play football, but also to go to college and get a degree. And I also think Corey abandons that as well, though, and adopts Troy's perspective when he enlists him in the Marines. I'll get to that a little later, though, when summing up Corey's character arc. Anyway, the second story that Troy tells is the one where he made a deal with who he thought was the devil to get some furniture. Troy said he wasn't able to get credit to furnish the house, and then the devil appears and he makes a payment arrangement of $10 a month and has been paying that $10 for 5 years. He said if he ever missed a payment, that the furniture would be taken away. Everyone immediately notes how the furniture should have been paid off by now, and Troy says he has paid it off multiple times but continues to do so he'll never have to run into the devil again. And I think this is just another form of vigilance for Troy. He sees the devil, like death, as someone he must stay on his toes to get the better of. Also, how ironic is it that Troy's refusing to give Lyons a $10 loan, yet tells the story of giving away $10 a month, even though he knows he doesn't have to pay it. Now, Rose refutes the whole story and says that Troy got the furniture from one of their neighbors, so right now we have no idea what really happened, but I'm more inclined to believe Rose because Troy has been shown to be quite delusional up to this point. Anyway, Troy refuses to give his son the money and Rose puts her foot down and does it herself. Troy has no belief that his son will ever pay him back. The scene then ends with Bono leaving and Troy yelling about his plans of intimacy with his wife throughout the weekend. Also, Troy's view on Rose for the most part in the movie are so endearing, and that makes his mishandling of her that much more harder to deal with. In Troy's eyes, Rose is the best thing that ever happened to him, and a woman who set him straight. From their earlier conversations before marriage, she demanded two things of him: marriage and to be a priority over baseball. Also, baseball is central to the story as well. Troy was an uber-talented player in the Negro Leagues, seemingly the stuff of legends, but racism ultimately kept him out of the pros. Troy harbors that resentment. It creates the main tension between him and Corey, and I believe this is where his philosophy about survival is really derived from. For him, sports was the thing he loved most, and society took that away from him. So now he just does things so he can function in, and those can't be stolen. He tells Corey instead of going for sports, his son should focus on getting a trade. See, that's something no one can take from him. Troy deprives himself of true contentment, and this is the thing that leads him to destroy his family. Isn't it odd, though? The one thing society can't steal from you is your family, and Troy's actions pretty much gives them away. Troy is godlike in this story to his family, and I guess in a Greek tragedy, this will be his hubris. Anyway, the next morning you see Troy and Rose in the backyard, and again, a lot of things are set up in the scene. Troy complains about a string of things within 10 minutes. He gets on Corey for being at football practice and not doing his chores. He complains about the recruit coming to see him about Corey's college potential. He believes Rose wasted her money on the lottery. Ironic after his devil story though. And he complains about the sellout restaurant owner. The story of the restaurant owner is the most telling one for me, as Troy sees the owner as someone who got something new and then treated the people around him bad. I wonder if Troy later on sees himself like that when he cheats on his wife. See, both money and intimacy are fleeting feelings, but love, family, and community are foundational, something Troy and the owner would soon forsake for their own pleasure. Rose again calls him out every time and then goes in the house to make breakfast. She also tells him not to worry about losing his job, sensing that his frustration may be coming from the feeling of losing his stability, which ultimately is where the scene ends off in a few moments here. After this, some ruckus is heard from the front yard, and then we get our first introduction to Gabriel, Troy's older brother. Gabe is a war vet who had half of his head blown off and now lives with a metal plate in his skull, giving him mental and physical disabilities. The settlement was the reason Troy could afford the house, and he initially took care of Gabe until Gabe decided to move out the house so he wouldn't bother Troy. In this scene, Troy tells Rose how bothered he is that the only reason he has a house is because of his brother's tragedy and considers himself a failure because of it. This is another moment of Troy's discontentment in himself, and his philosophy of survival has failed him in this regard. Anyway, Gabe is probably the most endearing character in this whole movie. Gabe believed that he died and came back with the sole purpose of opening the gates of heaven for those trying to get in. Yeah, Gabriel, the angel in the Bible often depicted as the messenger angel. Gabe even carries around a horn with him. Throughout the movie, he mentions that he's fighting off hellhounds. Ironically, the first time he says this, it's just him and Troy. Also took that as the movie saying that Gabe was sensing something around Troy and was trying to protect his little brother. You never get a clear answer on if Gabe's story is true, although the end of the movie heavily suggests that it is. Rose comes back out the house, and Gabe tells Rose that Troy is mad at him, and Troy tries to reassure him that he isn't. I also noted that Gabe is the only person who gets this kind of treatment from Troy. Sure, Troy is softer to Rose than anybody else, but he has moments of anger for her, and he's more jovial with Bono even telling him that he loves him. Something that he doesn't tell his sons, by the way. But with Gabe, you see how much Troy cares for him. He wants to do right by his brother. I think in Gabe you can see the cost of a black man to love his brother. Gabe is portrayed to be the salt of the earth, and not just because of his disabilities, but because he believes himself to be commissioned by St. Peter. Gabe tells Troy that St. Peter showed him the book of life and everyone that will enter into the gates, but specifically shows him Troy's name. Now, when I first watched this scene, I took it as Troy wouldn't get into heaven because of his dumb decisions, and later on saw it as Peter telling Gabe he would have to be Troy's personal escort into the gates. But I'll get to that point later. Anyway, Gabe runs off to chase hellhounds, and Troy gets into an argument with Rose. Rose thinks Gabe should be hospitalized for his own sake, and Troy thinks he should be allowed to be free. He hasn't done anything to anyone. Troy then gives his speech about how terrible he feels because the only reason he is stable in life is because of Gabe's accident. Stability for a 50-plus-year-old man comes at the expense of his brother. For Troy, one of the costs of loving Gabe is a constant reminder of his own failure. Troy storms out and goes to the bar, or as we know, or at least I know, to see Alberta. It's early. Now, I'm not sure if Troy began the affair before this, but if he didn't, I would pinpoint this moment. Troy's affair is a reaction to his discontentment, and this is one of the 3 times he has an outburst of rage because of it. 2 of those times are centered around Alberta. I'll get it right one day. Troy leaves, and Corey comes in. Rose tells him to go do his chore. Later on, we see Rose leaving as Troy comes back. Troy is clearly a little tipsy, so his demeanor is really playful and sexual with his wife. It then turns aggressive when he sees Corey. Actually, I take that back. He initially has a somewhat decent conversation with Corey about TV, baseball, and the roof. Troy prioritizes the roof over a TV Corey wants, but ultimately says if Corey can come up with half the money, Troy will get it. This may be their only real cordial scene. It is then immediately ruined when baseball is brought into the conversation and Troy gets angry with Corey. He then tells Corey football is out of the question unless he can also work, and then Corey reveals he's given up his job except for on the weekend. Troy doesn't accept this and tells Corey that sports are just going to let him down because they were let down for Troy. He sends Corey to ask for his job back, and Corey then asks his father why doesn't he like him. And then Denzel gives one of the better monologues of the film. Troy says he doesn't have to like him, but he owes him a responsibility as his father, so he has to do right by him. He never even couches that responsibility in any kind of love for Corey. Also note that Troy is very physically aggressive with Corey. It makes him say yes sir to him, pounds him on his chest. The scene is very drill sergeant-like, which is interesting for a boy who ends up in the Marines. Rose enters as Corey leaves, and she is immediately rebuking Troy. She tries to explain to her husband that his son just wants to make him proud and to get some emotional response out of him. Troy then gives a speech about how that's asking too much of him, and he can only give his son a home, clothes, and food. He works hard for his family and provides for them. Actually, the only thing that doesn't cost money that he offers is sex with Rose, but even then he says that as if it's more of a responsibility. The most poignant line to me is that Troy says he doesn't have any tears to give because he spent all of them. He just functions right now. And that's one of the costs of loving a black man who has been conditioned to survive and not to be fully human. In reality, true love, especially for his children, is asking of Troy something that is beyond his capability. I also think part of the problem is how Troy views his father. Later on, he tells us that his father took care of his kids. It's one of the things that Troy actually respects about his father, even if he didn't talk about his father loving his kids. I think Troy learned it there. A man has to take responsibility for his kids. He also says his father and mother didn't really get along, and he has this disdain for his father because of that. I also think there's a reason why he loves Rose so hard and expresses it so much to convince himself and everyone else he's not his dad. Anyway, Troy ends his rant to Rose, stating that he has nothing left to give. An important line to remember. The next scene I want to talk about is Bono and Troy talking in the dining room when Gabe walks in. See, Gabe walks in and he hands Rose a flower and says, "I got you a rose, just like you." How can you not like this guy? Almost forgot. This is right after Troy comes back from learning that he gets to keep his job. He wasn't fired. Actually, it turns out that he becomes a driver and he doesn't have a license. So now he has what he wants, but isn't really equipped to deal with it. I see foreshadowing of his relationship with Alberta, but I may be reaching. Anyway, Rose makes Gabe a sandwich, and Lyons walks in, and Troy immediately assumes the worst. Lyons is actually here to pay Troy back the money and invite him to hear him play. Troy refuses to take the money and says Lyons should keep it for the next time he needs to borrow money. Lyons eventually gives the money to Rose, which, of course, that's who we got the money from in the first place. Troy then refuses to go see Lyons play, and then they all head to the backyard. Troy tells the story of his father. Bono, though, before Troy tells the story, talks of black men having the walking blues. These were men who couldn't stay in one place, so they kept making babies wherever they go and just moving on to another person. Troy has the walking blues in some sense, but he can't recognize it because of his circumstances. For him, it's just been Rose. But he isn't with Lion's mother because of the fact he was in jail. He married Rose and had Corey. Then he has Raynell with Alberta. And of course, he really isn't around to fully raise any of them. He's probably around Corey the longest, but isn't emotionally there. So Troy describes his father as the devil himself. And Troy figures that's the reason why he escaped death for so long. He then mentions the moment he lost fear in his father, which is important. Troy is having a sexual encounter with a young lady instead of doing his chores. And then his father comes up and beats him. And initially, Troy just feels angry and embarrassed. He then noticed his father chases him off so he can sleep with the young lady. It's this that allows Troy to drop his fears and fight his father, the violation of a young woman. I also see Corey in this scene a lot, who decides to fight Troy after not being afraid of him because how he treated his mom, the violation of another woman. Anyway, Troy loses the fight with his father, walks north, and begins a new life. He meets Lion's mother, and up to that point took care of himself by robbery. He eventually kills a man and goes to prison because of it. This is where he meets Bono, by the way. They never explain what Bono does to go to prison. I don't think it's that important, but just something to note. Lion's mom leaves him, and that's the reason Troy isn't in his life. It's this moment that Troy and Lion seems to bond. Lion never knew about his father, and I think this is where they have reconciliation and closure to the story arc. You actually never see them again together in a scene after this. Lion tries to get Troy to come see him one more time, and Troy refuses. Bono even tried to convince him, and Troy stands his ground. Once again, you're asking a man to love that can't. And for Lions, he realizes the cost of a black son loving his father like Troy is living life without approval. How broken. Rose tries to intervene and also tells Troy that he's going to let Corey play football. Troy refuses both and tells them that Corey lied to him and doesn't have a job at all, and there has to be consequences. Lions then leaves, and shortly everyone walks through the front door where Corey shows up in the scene. He throws his football helmet at Troy and begins to yell. Troy told his coach Corey couldn't play football because Corey lied to him. Corey says his father is just jealous of him, and then Troy gets creepily calm. He calls Corey over to him and makes him strap up his helmet. Again, very drill sergeant-like, and then tells Corey he swung and missed. Corey is now on strike one, and Troy warns him not to strike out. Troy also has a way of speaking through baseball when he wants to talk about his feelings because he is a man who doesn't allow himself to feel, and the only passion he has is baseball. Anyway, I want to talk about 4 more scenes in the movie I think is important to give you my final thoughts. Bono, Corey, and Troy are working on the fence in the backyard, and Bono pulls his final rebuke. Bono wants the best for Troy and Rose and doesn't want Troy to hurt her. Back to the accountability piece. This is Bono drawing the line in the sand. Troy says he can't get Alberta off of him, and now he's stuck, alluding to the baby, but never saying it directly. Troy deflects and asks Bono about this new fridge his wife wants, and Bono says, "I'll get it when Troy finishes the fence for Rose." Bono also gives the speech about fences keeping people in and out. Rose wants to keep her family in with her, and I think Troy sees the need for the fence to keep things out, but that's coming later. Also, Bono tells Troy that Troy has taught him a lot through Troy's mistakes. In fact, choosing Rose was the only sensible thing Bono notes that Troy has done. Interesting. Troy goes to tell Rose about the affair and the baby, and Rose is shattered. She says she could have expected this from Troy at a younger age, but why now? Discontentment has no age limit, and that's just my reading. A fool is a fool is a fool. We also see Gabe walking in at this point. Troy had just got Gabe out of jail, and Gabe comes in with flowers for Rose, but she's too distraught to interact with him, so she just takes it and continues to yell at Troy and walks out the house. She drops the rose by a fence and gives the speech of a lifetime. Rose's first concern that the affair and baby were a result of her lacking as a woman. Troy assures her it isn't. For him, Alberta is an escape from reality and responsibility. There, he can have pleasure, a liberty he doesn't allow himself in his day to day with his family. Troy then tells Rose he had been stagnant. He's put his life on pause for his family, and he won't stop seeing Alberta because it's time for him to get more than he receives. Rose calls Troy's out again. He isn't the only one who gives. She gives the perfect speech about the cost of loving Troy. She gave up her hopes, dreams, desires for other men, and not even for the perfect partner. My favorite part is when she says she's buried so much of herself in Troy. She watched and prayed over it and hoped that it would bloom into something, but it didn't take her long to figure out that that wasn't a possibility with Troy. She then finds contentment in the man she marries because she knew that would be the only way she'd survive as his wife. Rose's sense of responsibility for her family isn't that far from Troy's, in my opinion, but she finds contentment in that because she can turn that sense of responsibility into genuine love and not just duty. She ends it with, "You take more than you know." Troy then grabs her, and Corey comes out the house and pushes Troy off of Rose, receiving strike two. Strike two. Can I say I almost cried multiple times in this movie? And this scene is one that chokes me up every time. The pain in Rose is so tangible. The cost of a black woman loving a black man is so heavy when he is just in a mode of survival. After this, Troy doesn't have a good relationship with anyone. Corey doesn't speak to him. Rose doesn't speak to him. Bono walks out of the bar on him because, again, accountability. He even signs papers that have Gabe institutionalized, which Troy says he was tricked into because he can't read. I think his scene with Bono is so important because Troy talks about how becoming a driver didn't give him the satisfaction he thought, which for me is an immediate parallel to the affair with Alberta. As a driver, he isn't satisfied because he's alone. His affair leaves him in the same spot. There also is a lot of pain because of what happened to Gabe. Rose sees this as the biggest indictment on Troy's character. Also, Rose takes up going to church, which is just another form of anesthesia in the black community. I say that as a Christian and a minister, but religion is the greatest anesthesia for people hurting. Anyway, up to this point, there is a lack of vigilance on Troy's part, and death comes to visit him once more. Rose wakes up to a call from the hospital. It's the doctor, and Raynell has just been born. Rose also says that Alberta died during the birth. She tries to comfort Troy, but he pushes her away. So she leaves the room, and he comes to the window to have another talk with Death. Troy tells Death it's personal and that Death should stay on the other side of the fence until he's ready for Troy. Troy's fence is to protect his family from Death, and he admits Death got close enough to him by killing Alberta because he wasn't vigilant. But he vows that it will never happen again. Troy enters the next morning with baby Raynell and delivers for me what is the funniest stretch of lines in the movie. He says, looking at a distraught Rose, "Now, she's innocent and she don't know nothing about grown folks' business." Troy then walks out to the back porch and starts to sing a song about the conductor letting him ride the train and talks to baby Raynell about being homeless before. See, Troy doesn't have the walking blues. He's just a man jumping trains, right? He even talks to Rose about his responsibilities to the baby, not regretting her and knowing that he's the only person she has. He asks Rose, can she raise the baby with him? Troy, even in his dumbest, darkest hour, still won't abandon his child, which says there's something good inside of him, but it's just wrapped around a lot of mess. Rose agrees to raise the baby because she realizes Raynell is innocent and alone. Troy isn't innocent, so he can be alone, and Rose delivers this line, which usually gets a standing applause in the theater. "This baby got a mama, but you, a womanless man." How amazing, right? Yeah, the baby and Troy both lost Alberta, but Raynell gains Rose and Alberta's absent, and Troy is losing both Alberta and Rose. I want to now go to the scene of Corey's third strike. At this point, Rose isn't talking to Troy, and now he's a drunk, despondent old man sitting on the back porch. No Rose, no Alberta. Heck, not even Bono is with him. Corey enters the backyard and is about to walk up the steps and tells Troy to move. Troy demands respect from Corey, who has none to give, and Corey now tells Troy that he isn't afraid of him. When Troy tries to kick him out, Corey stands his ground and delivers some deep cut saying, Troy only got this house because of Gabe. Troy knocks Corey down to the ground and Corey gets up and grabs the bat. This sends Troy into a different zone, telling Corey that he'd have to kill his father if he's willing to pull a bat on him. Troy overtakes Corey and chokes him out with the bat. Afterwards, he runs Corey out of the yard and begins to stare into the sky. He's losing his vision and then comments that he can't taste anything, so he grabs the bat and cries hallelujah and begins to threaten death, saying once again, anytime you're ready. Now I always see the scene as Troy realizing he is losing his ability to feel, becoming more and more like his dad, and since he wanted his dad to die, he's more welcoming to death. Now for the final scene of the movie, I just wanted to touch on where characters end up and not necessarily the plotting of it. Bono was there to make sure everything is right with Troy's family for the funeral. He didn't completely abandon Troy and said he loves Rose as well as Troy, so it makes sense that he's there. Bono is an amazing friend to have. He is both loving and willing to call his friend out when he is ruining something good. Bono is probably the most consistent character as well. His arc is one that we see from the very beginning. He couldn't keep Troy straight though, despite his many attempts. Rose is raising Raynell, and she is slightly more hard on Raynell than we seen her with Corey, but maybe that's just because Raynell isn't listening to her this morning. She also does say that she's going to do for Raynell what Troy did for Corey, but she says it as if it's a good thing. She reflects that Troy gave her a home she could sing in, but she didn't demand that he left space in the house for her. She let him become too big and take responsibility for it. Rose seems to have closure at this point though. For her, the brokenness in her marriage came from Troy's behavior and her lack of demands, and not just in a you'll give lions $10 kind of way. In fact, most of Rose's demands on Troy present day were centered around his treatment of others and not herself. Lyons is serving time in prison for cashing other people's checks, and I wonder if he naturally just was shady or did he get the idea of doing illegal things after hearing Troy's story about stealing to survive. Maybe I was wrong in the beginning of the review, and Lyons ends up adopting Troy's mentality, and it cost him. Also, you see Corey and Lyons together on screen for the first time. Lyons talks about Troy in a more positive manner, as if he empathizes with Troy. The speech he gives about his dad needing to hit home runs further than anyone, and the fact that Troy would go 0-3 on base and then hit a beauty spoke to his character. Troy was flawed and did amazing things because he wanted to be a spectacle. I think Lyons sees himself as that with his music. Also, Lyons mentioned his band that he has in prison to Corey, something Corey doesn't react to, but I'll get to that later. Raynell is such a precious and seemingly wise beyond her years young lady. She seems really drawn into Corey and has similar ways about her. She innocently has small rebellions against things Rose says like Corey would to Troy. And she also seems really drawn to Corey from the moment he steps in. She knows that Troy calls her room Corey's room and even keeps his football. Maybe Troy would have reconciled with Corey given the chance. Raynell also delivers a tear-jerking moment when she sings the song about Blue the dog. It's the third time that we hear this song, but we never heard the full song before she sings it. She calls Corey over to her, asking if he ever heard about Blue, and when Corey begins to sing the song about Blue, she finishes. At the end of the song, Blue is tired and he dies. And although he wasn't the perfect dog, he goes to sleep where all the good dogs go. Man, I cried and everyone near me in the theater did as well. This also visibly shakes Corey out of his anger. Corey has one of the bigger changes. He doesn't become the antithesis to Troy that I expected. No, he just becomes Troy. Sure, he isn't as externally mean, but Troy was charming and charismatic when he wanted to be. When Lyons mentioned he has a band, Corey never even bothers to say if he'll go see him, something Troy would do. He refuses to go to the funeral and even gets into a shouting match with his mom. She tells him that he can't become a man by being angry at his dad, and that Troy was so deeply woven into Corey. Yeah, Troy became the man he was in protest to his dad, but Corey did too, and they both eventually just became their dads. After the song, Corey seems to soften. At the end, I think Corey shows the cost of loving a black man who is destructive may indeed turn you into that man. Good parts and bad parts included. Gabe. Gabe delivers the moment where tears uncontrollably stroll down my eyes each time. He comes into the backyard with his horn in his hand and he says, "It's time." I cry every time at this very moment. When I was writing my notes down for this, I just started crying even writing that line. He attempts to play his horn, and when it doesn't work, everything in me breaks. Gabe cries a little while holding the horn up to the heavens and yells out, "Troy," like he's reminding St. Peter of his mission. Gabe then blows into the horn one last time, and after a struggle, a long and beautiful note rings out. The sun then begins to shine, and everyone is awestruck. At this point in the movie, everyone in the theaters is in full-blown tears. But then Gabe, in Gabe-only fashion, says, "Now that's how that's supposed to work." And everyone erupts into laughter as he walks away. Was Gabe really sent back to escort Troy into heaven? And then the movie ends. So that was my review of Fences. Like I said, I really enjoyed the movie. It was my favorite one of 2016. And I think because as a black man, I've seen a lot of themes in there that I faced in my life and it was very relatable. So yeah, this was Juan doing Faith in Films deep dive. Also, email me or contact me about other films that you would like to get an in-depth analysis about. But until next time, peace.